Hey, how you doing? Sorry I didn't put up a video last week, but I want to talk a little bit about the readings from last week and this week as well. I just got back from China midweek last week, and so it was a very kind of instructive visit and interesting and all of that. So perhaps I'll talk about that at some point as well. Um, Let me just talk a little bit about why I put the readings on that I did last week, and then why we're doing the ones that we have this week. Last week's were both ostensibly about environmental issues. My own paper is clearly about a philosophy of place and redefinition of nature through Aldo Leopold. Jonathan Maskett's paper is about consumption. And the reason I put those two papers on this course's reading list was that it seemed to me that if we were going to think about knowledge, responsibility in society, or knowledge, social philosophy and ethics, one danger might be to think of it fairly abstractly, fairly aridly, and suppose that all we really need to do is get straight how our epistemology works, how our ethics works, and so forth. And um, really, last week's and this week's readings are an attempt to muddy the waters a bit, I suppose. To say that when philosophy starts taking its tasks seriously within, I don't know what to say the real world exactly, but a world of a complex world. Let's put it that way. It's not quite so simple as it may seem, and I think both Coates and Kitcher's books try and get at that as well. So last week's readings, my paper on philosophy in place was an attempt to basically say, look, one way to get around some of the issues within environmentalism, which have come to pass through an approach in ethics that I think of as expanding the circle approach. So Peter Singer is famous for that. One way to think about a way around those problems is that you can think about what it means to think from a place. Now, what are those problems? Well, those problems tend to cluster around the question of diffusion. In other words, the further out you go with your ethical notions, the more it seems you're stretching the notion of how ethics might work. So it's easy to talk about ethical responsibility towards other people. It's harder, but still not that hard, to talk about ethical responsibility towards animals because animals may feel pain and things of that nature, and so they're like analogs of people. How do you have ethical responsibilities towards trees? How do you have ethical responsibilities towards ecosystems or biospheres? Then the pain issue is gone, or if not gone, at least, much more metaphorical. How do we talk about ethical obligations towards inanimate nature? Do we have any, or do we have ethical obligations towards Mars or the moon or something like that? Is it only based on the possibility that there might be life on Mars, or what if we establish that there is no life in a place, let's say the moon? Can our ethics extend to that? And I think part of the problem of the kind of expanding sphere notion of ethics is that it gets more and more attenuated, more and more diffuse, more and more difficult to make the argument the further out you go, and then other issues come to bear on it. Issues around, human self-determination, and its limits. Can we limit people ethically on things that they might want to do when it's a very hard argument to make that there's an ethical obligation towards inanimate objects or whatever? Is our obligation towards ecosystems or nature predicated solely on the question of how this is going to affect us down the line? So not us, but our heirs, our children and grandchildren and so forth. Is that the only obligation we have towards nature, which is really a disguised obligation to ourselves? So these are all problems, it seems to me, because the question of responsibility then really ultimately is a question of responsibility towards ourselves. And it seems to me that an ethics of place needs to be able to do better than that. I mean, we need to be able to talk about our ethical obligations or stance towards things and not anthropomorphize them, not start from the notion that our obligations come from the fact that these things are like us, or that these things have implications for us, or something of that nature. And it seems to me there are a couple of ways to go on that. And the common way to go, if that's an issue for you, is what I think of as a kind of romantic way. In other words, to imbue or invest the natural order with a life of its own. So, that has a kind of quasi-transcendental sort of notion. We have obligations to nature because they're in the image of God, or, they reflect some kind of subjectivity or spirit or soul or whatever outside of us. And so that puts, ethically, that puts those things on the same level as us and makes them something other than us. But it also requires a certain kind of commitment, a certain kind of belief. What if you're not willing to kind of posit that there's, it's really amounts to a kind of religious sort of stance towards nature. And so it seems to me that's a it's got its own difficulties to argue that case. So, my notion of the ethics of place is an attempt to get around those two problems. The problem of the expanding circle notion that I've sketched out, and then the problem of the romantic notion, which requires a certain set of beliefs. And my approach in ethics of place is to say, look, this is a kind of model of the way that we in the university operate in terms of disciplining ourselves and in terms of thinking about interdisciplinarity. In other words, we've earned the right to speak from a particular disciplinary background by embodying its questions, by understanding its material, and all of those sorts of things. And then we, if we're doing it properly, we approach other disciplines understanding that they too have that background and history. And then the question is, how do we generate new questions when we come into encounter with each other? And so that forces us to be somewhat self-reflective on our own discipline, because other disciplines show the limits of our discipline. Philosophy has often, had the presumption in the past that it is the queen of the sciences, it's queen of everything, and therefore, it understands all of the things that other disciplines, are doing because it has the theories behind those things. I think in this day and age, that's a hard case to make anymore. I think for philosophy now, we are realizing that we have a set of methods. They're legitimate, they're worthwhile, and all of that sort of thing, but other people have other kinds of experiences, and it's the most interesting philosophical questions happen when we are willing to subject our own methods to a kind of critique brought about by the encounter that we have with others. So you can see various thinkers, certainly in the 20th century Jewish tradition, talking in these terms, Levinas, Buber, a number of others as well. So for me, the notion of place is always a limited notion, but an expansive notion. We understand our place, and then we understand what encounter means with others. And so if we transplant that into the natural world, we understand that nature itself knows, which is, as I said in the paper, my controversial claim. And what I mean by that is that it is like a text which is written on over and over and over again, and that writing in a certain sense has developed over time a kind of, I won't say equilibrium, but a way of operating within its own terms of reference. And so, the obvious example would be ecosystems having, again, not a balance, but a move through time that may have cycles, may have tensions, and all of those sorts of things, but has a kind of stability and I won't say direction. I don't want to be that teleological about it, but a kind of recognition that nature is always in the process of encountering other regimes of knowledge, other natural regimes of knowledge, and adjusting and reacting. We are the only ones that think we can rise above all of that. And really, all I'm asking for us to do is recognize that, no, we are implicated within it as well. We have not risen above it all. We too are natural beings in that sense. And so it is incumbent upon us to be able to reflect upon our own, systems of knowledge, what we think we know. And I think there are a lot of implications that come out of that. And among other things, a lot of ethical implications that come out of that. So, so that's some of the reasons why I put my paper on there. I put Jonathan Mascott's paper on for a very simple reason, and that is that he brings up the issues of desire. I think sometimes philosophers think that, you know, all we need to do is make the logic of something clear and straightforward. All we need to do is get our epistemology straight, as it were, and everything else falls in line. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think, Mascott nicely picks up the issue that, uh, you know, uh, when we talk about consumption, we are really talking about issues that operate at levels other than the rational, and we all know that, right? I mean, we rationally can tell ourselves, I shouldn't be having that chocolate. I shouldn't be doing this, I shouldn't be doing that, but some of the time we do it anyway. And so, I think Mascott just usefully adds this aspect to the whole discussion of knowledge, responsibility, and society to say, it's not quite so simple as it may seem. It's not just that we can get our intellectual world straight and then either things will follow for us or for anyone else. And this goes back to Hume in my mind. I mean, reason is and always should be, always will be a slave to the passions. And, I think Hume was right about a lot of stuff, and I think he was largely right about that. I think, those are the reasons that I put those two papers on for last week. Now, let me say a word or two about the papers that we have for this week, the Burroway paper and the O'Leary paper. I think I wanted to finish off this course with a kind of expansion, I suppose, of the questions. As I just said with previous papers, there's a certain sense that philosophy becomes really interesting when it is at the edges of its own space, as it were, its own disciplinary space and that of others. And I think the papers that we have before us really, in different ways, pick that up. I mean, the Burrowoy paper, sorry, Burrowoy, there we go, paper. You might have been surprised to see a paper on social sciences on a course like this, but it seems to me that the social sciences for a long time have been swimming in our waters, as it were. They've been raising the philosophical questions, and there are many ways to do the social sciences, some of them very quantitative, and those are probably further away from, philosophical reflection. But, I personally know a lot of social scientists of various sorts that are very conversant with philosophy. And it seems to me when we're talking about knowledge, responsibility, and society, that talking to the people whose first order of business is to reflect on the nature of society is not a bad thing. And they often have wanted to talk to us, and I think it's worth philosophers trying to find not the common ground, but the ground of conversation, right? Because common ground always feels to me a little bit like, we're just finding where we can agree on things. And I'm not sure that's the most productive space to look for. I think the interesting space to look for is the space where we are understanding concepts differently and that we can raise those to the surface, and educate each other, essentially, in order that we can all ask better questions about our, about some object of investigation. Burroway is, I'm just looking at the paper quickly here, talking about Immanuel Wallerstein, who's famous for world systems theory, and which is kind of a large-scale accounting of the trajectory of human culture and has no small amount of philosophical content in it as well. And so, what Burroway is arguing for here, he's arguing, as he says in the title, for provincializing the social sciences. And I think by that, excuse me, he means provincializing more disciplines than just social sciences. And so, that, in my ears, that sounds like disciplines knowing their place. And, so I think there's a certain resonance with what I've been trying to argue for as well. If philosophy is to participate in this discourse, knowing their province, knowing their place, but not be limited to that, I think what that means is that not that we give up our striving for reflection on universals. Okay, I mean, I think that's part of our lifeblood. You know, we cannot get away from thinking about what knowledge is in a kind of universal sense, what truth is, what the good is. I mean, this is just what we do as philosophers. But where I think it is useful to be in conversation with social scientists and others is to say we don't have the sole um, source for all of the possible shadings of the concept, all of the possible, what I call provenance of the concepts, and simply reflecting on them the way we normally do, I think is limits us quite a lot. So I think Burawoy is trying to give us a social scientist version of what I've been trying to argue for as well. O'Leary is moving us, as the title suggests, towards the practice of philosophy. I when I've written about African philosophy, this has been an issue because any number of African philosophers have tried to argue that what makes African philosophy African is that it has an application to an African life world. That is, it proposes solutions to African problems. And if you think about it, that's the notion of the applicability of philosophy is always a difficult thing because, um, for many philosophers, our chief purpose is not to figure out how we apply things, but to think through them and think through them carefully. Having said that, our concepts always have a history, an audience, another set of concepts that also have currency. And so, within African philosophy, certainly the question of applicability is certainly, a live one, but it's not quite so simple as simply saying, let's come up with, solutions to Africa's problems. I mean, who gets to define those problems? I mean, in Africa, quite often it's going to be whoever has the most power, the president, will define the problems for a country. Well, are those really the problems? Are they just going to be the things that keeps him in office or the things that keep his particular group happy or something like that? I mean, and that's not limited to Africa. That's, many other places as well. I think O'Leary is trying, he goes via Foucault back to Socrates to think about the notion that a truly well thought out question and a truly well thought out concept always will turn out to have applicability. It's not going to be arid and abstract. And so when I think about knowledge, responsibility, and society, I think the approaches to epistemology, which are simply the abstract approaches, while they are useful, I mean, I would not want to say they should go away. At the end of the day, there is still the question of, sometimes I put it, who cares, right? Why does this matter? To whom does it matter? And things of that nature. So, I think it is possible to be a good philosopher and still take those issues seriously. I think the readings towards the end of this course, last week's and this week's, in the different ways have been trying to get at that question. How do you both be a good philosopher and take seriously the notion that your philosophy exists in a place that it has an audience, that it is addressing a real world, and those sorts of things. My analogies are often to things like other disciplines. Physics, for example, has pursued very abstract knowledge at times. The origins of quantum theory are extremely abstract, extremely, the application to the rest of the world was not at all obvious. Turns out that it has huge applications to the rest of the world. So, I am not the one who's trying to say, let's get rid of all of the kind of problems for their own sake. But I do think that in philosophy, there's been sometimes a distinction between the people who do that as being the real philosophers and the people who think about where the problems come from and all that sort of thing as being somehow secondary. They're doing applied philosophy. They're doing something that's not really as difficult or as respectable as the ones who are doing the pure stuff. And I'm not sure I'm very comfortable with that distinction in philosophy or really anywhere else. That's a few thoughts on the readings from last week and this week, and I know you're probably writing papers right now, and so I look forward to getting those. And so I'll talk to you soon.